All right, A&P2 students, we're going to continue on and talk about the stomach and some of the many functions of the stomach, and we'll probably have a second video to talk about how the stomach's functions or processes are regulated. All right, so let me go to our objectives, and we're gonna, number 17, I just kind of listed the various functions generally of the stomach. So most people are familiar that it stores material, ingested material, so it kind of holds on to ingested material before it sends it on down the small intestines. There is 3 instead of just 2 muscle layers in the muscularis layer. There are actually 3, and so that helps with the mechanical digestion of the material that's in the stomach. Chemical digestion is going on in there. We'll talk about some of the enzymes that are going to be produced and released in the stomach. We'll talk about some other digestive juices that are going to be secreted in there. There's a minor role in absorption. I put that on there because some things can get absorbed across the wall of the stomach, but most of the absorption is going to go on in the small intestines. And then we'll talk about this intrinsic factor, which is something that's needed for vitamin B12 absorption. So I am going to show you, so those are like the general functions. So we're going to go in a little bit more detail and talk about the cells that make up, and the various cells that make up the epithelium that lines the stomach. And so these are in the mucosa layer. And then we will talk, actually, I think we'll probably get through this in this video, and then we'll talk about how the stomach's functions are regulated. So there is a picture that goes along with Objective 18 in the textbook. So here's our stomach. So we're going to zoom in on our mucosa here. And there's a couple of pictures that they look at, but I like this one that kind of generally shows all the cells and what they produce, so you can kind of see it all in one picture. It's a little too big for my screen, but we'll make do. Okay. All right, so the first cells that we're going to talk about that are providing a valuable function for the stomach and for digestion is called the mucus cells. There's 2 different types of mucus cells, but I just have you know, I don't have you know the difference, just know they're mucus cells. And so they're going to, hence the name, produce mucus. So they'll be producing mucus, and you can actually see this layer of mucus that's on the surface of them. So these cells are, it's necessary that they produce that mucus, because what the mucus is doing is providing a physical barrier between these epithelial cells, all the epithelial cells that are lining the stomach or in the mucosa area, and so between the epithelial cells and this acidic environment that's in the lumen of the stomach. So we'll talk about where hydrochloric acid comes from, but this is a very harsh environment. This is one of the only places that we have such an acidic environment within our bodies, because our cells do not do well in acidic environments. Our cells will start to be denatured. All the proteins when the cells will be denatured, and they'll start falling apart and dying. So we need hydrochloric acid. We'll talk about reasons why in here, but we don't need it damaging the cells that are lining our stomach. So this mucus provides this physical barrier to protect these epithelial cells from this really harsh acidic environment that's in the lumen of the stomach. So, and these cells also undergo mitosis, regenerate pretty rapidly too, so that helps them to live in this harsh environment as well. So, all right, so that's the function of the mucus cells, and I'm going to go, I know the mucus cells were first, so they secrete that mucus that protects the lining of the stomach from all the acids, and even the enzymes too. I just kind of focused on the acids, but even enzymes that are in the stomach, we don't want them to start destroying any proteins that are in our cells either. So, all right, the parietal cells are the next cells that we'll talk about, and they have 2 different functions. So we'll go to our parietal cells. So here's the parietal cell. So we'll talk about this function first, where the parietal cells are producing a substance called the intrinsic factor. So this is our parietal cell, and it's producing intrinsic factor. So the importance of the intrinsic factor is that it's not going to stay in the stomach. It's going to go on and head down to the small intestines. And then what it's essential and necessary for is the absorption of vitamin B12. So you have to have intrinsic factor being produced by these parietal cells in the stomach, so that when the vitamin B12 gets to the small intestines, then the intrinsic factor can allow for the absorption of vitamin B12. So move the vitamin B12 from the digestive tract lumen into the blood. So intrinsic factor is essential for that. The vitamin B12, the reason why we need to make sure we absorb it and we have it in our bodies is because it's an important component of our red blood cells. So we didn't talk much about vitamin B12 when we did the blood chapter. We talked mainly about iron, but realize vitamin B12 plays a big role in the production of red blood cells. So if we don't have vitamin B12, we won't get normal production of red blood cells, and we can develop anemia. And so that's a essential factor produced by the stomach, essential substance that needs to be produced so that we can absorb vitamin B12 and then thus make normal red blood cells and not be anemic. So that's really important. You can have, it seems like there could be other issues with the intrinsic factor, but it seems like people that as they get older, they don't produce as much intrinsic factor. So then they have a decrease in the absorption of vitamin B12, and they can become vitamin B deficient and become anemic. So that's something they call that pernicious anemia. If it's caused by a vitamin B12 deficiency, they call it pernicious anemia. So that's something that we might have to treat and manage as people get older, is that possibility. All right. So that was one function of the parietal cells, is producing that intrinsic factor that will help with, and actually is essential for absorption of vitamin B12 so we don't become anemic. The next function is the parietal cells are responsible for producing the hydrochloric acid that is needed in the lumen of the stomach. Now, the parietal cell does not want to produce hydrochloric acid inside. So it doesn't want to produce it inside. So because if hydrochloric acid is inside this parietal cell, it'll start destroying and breaking down, denaturing all the substances and molecules in here inside the cell. So what the parietal cell does is it releases the hydrogen ion into the lumen of the stomach, and then it'll also release the chloride ion. And then once they're in the lumen of the stomach, then they will form hydrochloric acid. And then that's how we get this hydrochloric acid changing this environment, or maintaining this environment is very acidic. So those are the functions of the parietal cell: produce intrinsic factor, and then produce hydrogen and chloride, and not produce it, but release hydrogen and chloride into the lumen so that it can form hydrochloric acid. All right. So now I'm going to take the information about the parietal cells a little bit further, because I'm going to tell you parietal cells secrete the hydrochloric acid, but hydrochloric acid is necessary for two things. So we want to make sure that we talk about those two things. So when hydrochloric acid is in the lumen, what it's going to do is it's going to be there to convert an inactive enzyme. So this is an inactive enzyme called pepsinogen. It's going to convert it to pepsin, which is the active enzyme. So we need hydrochloric acid in the stomach lumen so that this chemical reaction can happen. This inactive pepsinogen enzyme can be converted to the active pepsin enzyme. And then we'll talk about pepsin is necessary for it's an enzyme, so it's necessary for the breakdown of protein that's in our ingested food and material our bolus that's coming into our stomach. So when we'll talk a little bit where pepsinogen comes from, but that's one role of the hydrochloric acid, is to convert pepsinogen to pepsin. So then once it does that, now we have this active enzyme called pepsin, then it can take any proteins that are in the stomach, not any, but a lot of proteins that are in the stomach, and then break the little chemical bonds between those individual amino acids and then produce these smaller chains of amino acids. So that's an enzyme that's undergoing or is responsible for chemical digestion, in this case of proteins in the stomach. All right, now the other thing is this pepsin enzyme. It's most of the enzymes in our bodies, they are active and fully functional and doing, the most effective when the pH is 7.4. So that's kind of our normal blood pH, and most of our enzymes like that pH, and they perform at optimal levels at that pH, except for a few of them. And so this is one of them. Pepsin does not perform optimally at any pH, above like 3. So the hydrochloric acid other role is to keep this environment acidic with a pH of like 3, in order to keep that pepsin working at optimal levels and breaking down those proteins. So it's kind of weird to have an enzyme that actually likes acidic environments, but this one does. So, all right, so that's the role of the hydrochloric acid that's produced by the parietal cells. So there's those two functions. So we got two more cells. The chief cells, that one is little bit more simple than the parietal cell, had a little bit more roles. The chief cells, their function is to produce that pepsinogen. So they produce the pepsinogen and then they release it into the stomach lumen. So that's the role of the chief cells. And the reason they don't want to release pepsin, so the reason the chief cells don't produce pepsin and just release it in there, is because pepsin breaks down proteins. So if pepsin's made inside this chief cell, there's a chance that while it's in there, it's going to break down proteins inside the chief cell and destroy this cell. So again, just like the parietal cells don't release hydrochloric acid, they release hydrogen and chloride that can combine to form hydrochloric acid. The chief cells don't release the active enzyme, they release the inactive one. That way we have these kind of harmful to our cells products. We have them in here, and we have barriers so that they don't destroy our epithelial cells that line our stomach. So, all right, so those are the chief cells. Their function: produce pepsinogen and secrete it, release it. All right, and then the last cell that you should be familiar with is is the G cell. So there's another name they use for the cell, but I just call it the G cell. I think it's easier. So these are the G cells. They are the ones that are producing a hormone. So we'll talk later about the stomach, how it's regulated. So it's regulated by the nervous system and by the endocrine system. So this is an example of a hormone that one of the cells called the G cells in the stomach lining produce. So they produce gastrin. That's the name of the hormone. And that hormone will be released into the blood. And then it's going to be released when there's food present. That's kind of what stimulates these guys to produce and release gastrin when food's present. So then the gastrin will get in the bloodstream, and then it'll come back to the stomach and then cause muscle contractions so we can get mixing of the contents in there. And then it stimulates the parietal cells to release hydrochloric acid and all that stuff. So it kind of stimulates the stomach functioning. So that is the G cell that produces the gastrin. Okay, so the next video we'll see you, and we will talk about how the stomach is regulated, all those functions that's going on.